info@nofamass.org. Feel free to contact me with feedback about this webinar or with any food access or webinar program questions. And I also take suggestions for future programming. Before we start tonight, I would like to thank our sponsors, Frontier Natural Products, Lancaster Agriculture, and UMass Risk Management and Crop Insurance Education Program for their support of this series. I'd also like to thank New Entry Sustainable Farming Project and Tufts Friedman School of Nutritional Science and Policy for providing access to the WebEx software that we're using tonight for this webinar. Also, many thanks to all the NOFAMAS staff, board members who have helped to make this workshop possible. And if you're not a member of NOFAMAS, I would strongly ask you to consider being a member, joining to support us in our education and policy work. You can visit our website to learn more. Tonight's presenter is Julie Fine. She is an instructor and master's candidate at the UMass Stockbridge School of Agriculture. Her topic tonight is cover crop mixtures for soil health. Now, tonight's format of the webinar will be a presentation with a question and answer session to follow. I really encourage everyone to participate in that portion, and you can do that simply by looking at the chat feature, which is at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can type in your questions as Ms. Fine is presenting, and you can also text me your questions if you are on our phone line. You can text it directly to me at 413-214-1237. And if you are on the phone or if you are looking at this live, if you can indicate to me how many people are watching it with you, if you're not by yourself, we really would appreciate that. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your holiday to be with us. And at this point, I am going to turn things over to Julie. Julie, you're out there, right?
Yep.
Okay. So there you go, and you can share your screen with us.
All right, so my name is Julie Fine. I am working on my master's degree at UMass Amherst, specifically focused on soil health, plant health, and utilizing cover crop mixtures to achieve those goals. I actually come from a farming background, from a vegetable production, and I actually originally started farming in California, and we really relied on cover crops to maintain our soil health. And so that's sort of where I came from when I started my degree. And I've had such pleasure in learning the science behind cover crops and looking at this complex ecosystem of soils. And so I'm hoping to share some of that science and then some of how to practice that. So I just wanted to start with this quote, which I love, sort of the big picture here. Soil is a living entity, the crucible of life, a seething foundry in which matter and energy are in constant flux, and life is continually created and destroyed. And I think that's important to start out with, remembering that what we're talking about when we look at soil is really this incredibly dynamic system. And what's going on there is this dynamic relationship between microbes, fungi, all kinds of living creatures, and the sun and plants. So you're actually, I like to sort of step back and look at it from the point of view of what's going on here is this tremendous cycling that the plants are using the solar energy from the sun to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use that carbon to create carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates, of course, feed the plant's growth, but they also are used, up to 40% of the carbohydrates that a plant creates are used to feed soil organisms, to foster that relationship. So those organisms are in return feeding the plant. And then as those soil organisms respire and die, they release carbon back into the atmosphere, and you have this incredible cycle. But I think that's essential to see, that this system is inseparable. You have these plants that need the microbes for their nutrition, the microbes that need soil for a home, the soil that needs these plants in order to get carbon to feed the microbes, and that every piece of the system is inseparable. And so when we're thinking about how to care for our crops, we also are thinking about how to care for our soil and the living creatures therein, because we can't have one without the other. So there are a lot of aspects to this idea of healthy soil, from soil aggregation, which is how our soil sort of holds together in these delicious crumbs, which create an excellent ecosystem for plant life and for water movement through the soil, for infiltration and drainage. And without those aggregates, soil has less of a capacity to actually hold water and drain water when necessary. Healthy soil is also a soil where erosion is not prevalent. And by caring for the sort of organic matter and creatures, by physically protecting the soil, we're also preventing loss of soil. And then obviously we care about healthy soil because healthy soil provides nutrients to our plants, so that we're not having to spoon feed them fertilizers, which are expensive, and also not good for the environment, even when we're using organic fertilizers. In addition, healthy soil supports healthy plants in terms of their immune systems and reducing plant pathogen loads. And interestingly, good soil actually has lower weed pressure. And that, as we all know, is essential for any kind of reasonable crop production system. And then there's this sort of more elusive term, resilience. But healthy soil sort of since it provides a piece of all of these different benefits, when things get rough, when we have droughts or hot spells, healthy soil actually provides a real boost to our crops that you can see when you contrast that with an unhealthy soil. So the soil health is a little tough to define. There's no one distinctive test that can tell you, like, yes or no, I have healthy soil. But it's essentially the combination of these spheres of physical, chemical, and biological factors that contribute towards soil health. And, in the sort of during the Green Revolution, we went a little overboard on the chemical side of things, interested in just sort of the chemical tests for soil, the pH and the macronutrients, the NPK, and the cation exchange capacity. And we sort of forgot that all of these realms really work together. That we have to have physically healthy soil, so we have to have those good aggregates or those good sort of crumbs that hold together, and that the texture of our soil really affects how we care for it. If it's a really sandy soil, we really need to treat it differently than if it's a clay soil, and so being aware of that should affect how we manage the health of our soil. And then compaction is something we want to prevent, but also something we need to address if we're going to meet our soil health goals. And then I think the most exciting thing in the last 20 years of agricultural research has just been the importance of the biological activity on healthy soil, what kinds of populations we have, the essential activity of earthworms and bacteria and fungi, the ratio of bacteria and fungi in a healthy soil, and then how do we feed all of those creatures? How do we supply sufficient carbon to provide them the snacks they rely on to build their populations and sustain their populations? So we're aiming to sort of address all of these spheres and get to the heart of healthy soil. And really the heart of it could be considered organic matter in your soil. As organic farmers, this is something we talk about, but organic matter is really the sort of the foundation. Without sufficient organic matter, there isn't enough food for all of these thousands of pounds of organisms that work the soil for us, that are cycling nutrients and building soil aggregates and reducing populations of negative bacteria. So we see that an increase in organic matter from 1 to 3% can reduce erosion by 33%. Just those healthy soil aggregates can do that. And that's low soil organic matter. That's not even aiming super high. although in our climate in the Northeast, it's hard to get really high soil organic matter in the sort of 6 to 8% range unless we're adding a lot of compost. And compost can come with its own problems in terms of an overload of phosphorus and also high costs if you're not producing it yourself. But we also see that soil organic matter, each percentage increase can increase the number of gallons of plant available water by about 16,000 gallons over the course of the growing season. That makes a big difference in crop production. So building soil organic matter is really primary to our healthy soil. And you can see in the little pie chart in the upper corner there that soil organic matter is made up of different fractions. They can't be easily distinguished from one another under a microscope or anything, but we sort of know that a large percent of organic matter is decomposing material, so that's either plant material or could even be the bodies of bacteria and fungi and invertebrates that have died and are decomposing. Then you have the more stabilized organic matter, which has already been decomposed somewhat and is basically in various forms of decay. But it's very stable. It's in these more tightly packed carbon rings and are very slow to decompose, like on the scale of hundreds of years. So, and then a smaller fraction are living organisms and fresh plant residue or root residue. So this is a good visual of what organic matter in healthy soil can get you. This is the difference between a healthy soil on the left, which is well aggregated and stable in water over time, which decreases compaction and increases water flow through the soil in times of excessive rain, or what you see on the right, which is a soil that's low in organic matter and those soil aggregates are really unstable. Tons of soil particles are falling out of that mix and are prone to erosion, runoff, and also to pooling and puddling on the soil surface, creating crusts. So when we look at how do we create that really healthy soil, other than organic matter, which we're managing for, we need sufficient nutrients for crop production. And I say that specifically because in my experience with cover crops, you can't plant a cover crop in a soil that's deficient and expect to recycle nutrients. Like, those nutrients have to be there in the first place in order to cycle them. So you have to make sure that you're starting out with sort of minimal sufficiency. And then healthy soil needs physical protection. So that's some kind of living material or mulch on the surface. Without that, a lot of damage can be done to soils just from rainfall, snowfall, and water flow. And then the other sort of big picture essential is food for soil organisms, and cover crops meet all of these goals. One of the things that I like to emphasize about...
Excuse me, Julie?
Yeah.
Can you share your screen so we can see your presentation?
Oh, you can't see it?
No.
Oh, no, I've been going through it this whole time. I had no idea.
Yeah, don't forget to share your screen.
Oh, I did. I clicked. Huh.
There it is.
Oh, no. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. That happens.
Oh, bummer. Okay, well, I'm going to show you this just because I think that whole thing might not have made much sense without seeing that image. All right, so there are the thoughts about organic matter, and that visual was essential. Oh, man. Okay, so here we are, this idea of one of the major benefits of cover crops is living roots. Now, how do I get that to go away? So root residues have the largest effect on soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is, when you look at how much soil organic matter is sort of laid down by roots and how much of that soil carbon is laid down by shoots, it's a really big difference. You have 50% of it that's actually sort of provided by root carbon, and only 13% if you're incorporating shoot biomass. So the idea of planting cover crops for living roots or for root contribution is really important. And in perennial system, basically 30% of what the plant is producing in terms of carbon fixation is deposited in the soil. That's a huge amount of carbon that your roots are providing. And then you really want to think about what type of roots are growing in your soil. Fine roots and tap roots, really branching roots, deep roots, shallow roots. All of them serve a function to feed the organisms in their strata of the soil. So that kind of root diversity is essential. And then living roots also protect soil aggregates by literally holding them in place and are feeding microbes as they grow. Whoa. Okay. Yeah, this is just a nice visual of who you're feeding when you're planting cover crops. And one of the things I wanted to point out in terms of the science of cover cropping is just how resilient soil can be. You can take a fairly abused soil and, given a few years of feeding it and protecting it, if you actually measure the biological populations in there, you can see a huge difference really quickly. It takes a lot longer to build soil organic matter and soil aggregates, but in terms of getting your biological populations moving, that is measurable pretty quickly. So the NRCS has these best practices for soil ecosystems, and they cover these sort of major areas of covering the soil, feeding the soil, reducing tillage, which can be really hard in vegetable production and really hard sometimes in garden settings. But the sort of major points there are to stay off wet soil, which I always find hard to do in the spring when I'm quite antsy to get growing, but also to conserve soil carbon. So maybe that means tilling less often, or maybe it means not tilling sometimes when you wish you could, just to conserve some more soil organic matter. And then the last principle is sort of what I'm going to talk more about tonight, which is cultivating diversity. So this means both in terms of crop rotation of your cash crop, but also potentially rotating the type of cover crop you're using, or using multi-species cover crops or border rows. And then also sort of thinking about how can I cultivate diversity in the insects and soil biota. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using different species. There are literally different relationships between peas and, say, oats in terms of what soil bacteria are attracted to those plant roots in the soil ecosystem. So just planting different types of things feeds a more diverse population. And then also root architecture has a big influence. Deep roots are moving carbon much deeper into the soil and sort of bringing those soil nutrients up to a higher strata. And like really branching roots, really active surface roots are also doing a lot to feed the more active population of soil bacteria that are at the soil surface. Let's see, one important thing to think about is that cover crop species are acquiring nitrogen in different ways. So we have legumes that fix atmospheric nitrogen, and grasses, which tend to be better at sucking up existing nitrogen. So we're trying to have a diversity here because it serves us well in many different spheres. So my own personal research is looking at cover crop mixtures. And the idea here is that we can get sort of maximized benefits from a diversity of species. So you get more erosion control if you're going to use a mixture of, say, rye and vetch than just vetch alone. Or you can build soil organic matter better if you have a combination of nitrogen providers and nitrogen scavengers. And that by using different species, you attract different soil biological populations. You have different capacity for nutrient scavenging in the soil based on root architecture or plant requirements. And the different cover crops have really different effects in terms of weed suppression. Some are really good at that, and others are quite lousy. So if you can combine them, you can actually really improve weed suppression. And then also, I'll talk more about carbon to nitrogen ratio. And also, biomass is a big effect that cover crops have. So you can have cover crops that do a lot of what you want, but they don't produce a ton of biomass. And so if you can combine that with high residue cover crops, you can get sort of a better balance of biomass contribution into your soil system. You can also use mixtures for forage. And then there's this idea that if you plant a mixture, then if you have, say, unusually dry conditions whenever you plant them, for example, whatever cover crop species does better under dry conditions will thrive. So you never get a failure, whereas you might if you planted peas and it was really dry. So those plants have the capacity to adjust to conditions that a farmer can't control, or gardener. So two of the sort of major things that we're thinking about when we design cover crop mixtures for soil health are quantity and quality. If you want to actively build soil organic matter, you actually have to put down a fair amount of above ground biomass every year. So the science tells us that it's about 5,000 pounds per acre per year if you want to build organic matter above current levels. And so that, if you imagine it, that's often like, say, a rye cover crop that comes up to your hips. It's a lot of biomass. So that can be a real challenge to manage that amount of biomass. And then the quality of that biomass also has a real influence on soil health. So your above ground biomass might have a lot of lignin in it. If it's rye, it could be that really sort of tough, almost straw-like residue by the time you till it in the spring, or by the time you're managing a fully grown rye cover crop. Or it could be really light cover crop biomass, so with a lot of cellulose, which is sort of that easy to digest, soft green tissue. But you want a real balance of those things. If you have too much of either one, it either is difficult to decompose if it's too much lignin, or decomposes rapidly if it's a lot of cellulose. So you want a nice quality cover crop residue that has a balance of those, and also a balance of carbon to nitrogen contained within the tissue. So carbon to nitrogen ratio is really important because the soil microorganisms are decomposing that for you, making it available to your plants. So basically, you need to sort of target a carbon to nitrogen ratio that microorganisms like. So that's something with a ratio of near 24:1. And as they decompose those nutrients, they're mineralized and released into plant-available forms. And here's a little sort of list of commonly used inputs and their carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we're aiming for 24:1, but say we put in a hairy vetch cover crop. That's 11:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. That's going to decompose pretty fast, and that's maybe faster than some of our crops can uptake it, depending on the timing of things. And then, if you put down something like a rye cover crop that is in anthesis, it's sort of at flowering, that can have a lot of carbon in it, and it can take a long time to break down. And meanwhile, that nitrogen is sort of immobilized in the cover crop tissue and not available to your plants. It actually really ties it up. So that's one reason we might want to use cover crop mixtures, is because you can, if you like rye, but you don't want that nitrogen immobilization period, you can combine it with a legume that has more nitrogen contained in it and get a better balance, closer to 24:1. So this is from my research looking at radish containing cover crop mixtures. So I was really I was really hoping that by mixing in oats with my radish cover crop, I would adjust that carbon to nitrogen ratio up a little bit, closer to 25. But what I found in 2 years of research was that the mixtures actually my mixtures didn't have a ton of difference. And part of that is that they were dominated by forage radish, which is a 22 to 1 ratio. So the oats added a little bit more carbon. But I was also really surprised to see that our local weed population, just if we let the weeds grow wild, they were actually a pretty low carbon to nitrogen ratio. They decompose really quickly in the spring. Those are just some examples. So when we think about selecting a cover crop mixture for implementation on our farms and gardens, when I used to think about selecting a cover crop, it was sort of like bottom up, if you look at this image. So you would sort of think about all the commonly used cover crops in your climate, and think about, what are my priorities? I want to cover the soil, I want to suppress weeds, and produce some biomass. So you sort of look at all of those different species and you think, well, I don't think that the peas don't produce enough biomass, and the radish doesn't provide enough biomass either, and so maybe I'll go with rye. And you sort of narrow it down. So you narrow it down. You say, okay, maybe rye is the best out of those. And that's what you use for your cover crop. But really, we're sort of thinking about this as, well, when I look at all of those species, they all serve a function within those priorities. And so you want to think about how you can use the different benefits of each cover crop species to create something that does what you're really looking for. This is a picture of the UMass research farm. And people, when they learn that I'm studying cover crop mixtures, they often say, well, what's the best one? Which is not a fair question. And I say, well, it depends. So you want to sort of start by looking at your priorities. Like, when is the niche? What is the niche? When do you have time to grow a cover crop? In between which crops and what season? When do you have time to plant them? And what are your goals? Are you really worried about suppressing weeds on a certain field? Or is it more important that you're recycling residual nitrogen after a well-fertilized potato crop, for example? Another thing is, how many species do you want to use while you're making a mixture? The more species, people used to think that 12 or 14-way mixtures, then you get the best out of all of those species. But more recent research has really shown that you kind of max out at 5 or 6 species. And a lot of people enjoy sort of managing less diversity, some diversity, but not too much. So another thing is, are they complementary? You don't want to plant rye and oats. They sort of serve the same function. They grow in the same area. They're similar types of grasses in some ways. So you want to sort of design some complementarity into your mixture. You want to think about cost, obviously. You don't want to pick all the expensive species. And then how are you going to plant it? Because some cover crop species have really different planting depth requirements. You can't plant peas and clovers sometimes at the same depth unless you have particular equipment. And also, when is your growth window? Do you have enough time to get your cover crop up and growing before either cold hits or before you need to use your equipment in summer? You've got to sort of think about timing. And then also, how are you going to terminate? Do you want to mow it, plow it? You want to let it winter kill? There are different reasons to choose different types of termination. My research is looking at winter-killed cover crops because I love the idea of letting the cold weather manage the termination of those and not having to do more tractor passes to terminate a cover crop or having to spray. So the idea here is that these mixtures are going to maximize benefits. You're going to get a little bit of the weed control from the radish, a little of your fertility needs from the peas. You're going to have similar ways to terminate those things. They're going to sort of balance each other out depending on what type of weather you get, and each sort of feed into this cover crop success. One really common example in our area, people use Vetch and Rye because you have this, major contribution of nitrogen fixation from the vetch, which is a bonus. But there are drawbacks like the prostrate nature, sort of falling over biomass. It doesn't produce a ton of biomass, and it decomposes pretty quickly in the spring. because it's so nitrogenous. And then you have rye on the other hand, which doesn't fix any nitrogen, although it's really good at scavenging it from what's left over in the soil. And it produces a ton of biomass, which can actually sometimes be a drawback, too much biomass to manage in the spring. So by planting a mixture, you kind of get like all the good stuff from vetch, all the good stuff from rye. And then another aspect of that is this idea of complementarity. So you have really complementary architecture forms. You have the tall vetch and the tall rye, which the vetch can climb up and use as a scaffold. And then you have this complementary nitrogen acquisition, right? The rye is scavenging it from the soil, whereas the vetch is fixing it in symbiosis with soil-dwelling bacteria. And then you have actually complementary termination, meaning they need to be terminated at the same time. Let's see. So I'm going to start showing you some of the results from a few of these interesting studies. And it's 7:30 already, so I'm going to skip a few things. But Penn State is doing some really interesting research on biomass production and carbon to nitrogen influence from cover crop mixtures. They're looking at all of these different things in combination. So they're looking at the monocultures of sun hep and sorghum Sudan grass and red clover and canola and all of these things. And then they're putting them together in these interesting mixtures. So they're doing all winter killed, all winter hardies, all of the different types of nitrogen scavenging, all of the different types of nitrogen fixing, and then combinations of all the winter killed, all the winter hardy, and then cross mixtures. So they're looking at a ton of these different mixtures. And the interesting thing is that they see this positive relationship between species richness, the number of species, and cover crop biomass. So the more species you have, the more biomass is produced, although it's sometimes not wildly different. There's quite a range depending on weather and soil and a lot of different things. But the interesting thing that they saw, and I think that is important for us to remember, is that the more biomass production they saw led to greater weed suppression and to greater nitrogen retention. Less nitrogen was lost to leaching. But it did negatively impact the nitrogen availability to the subsequent corn crop. So your goal can't be only lots of biomass, because then it's possible that you're actually going to take away nitrogen from your subsequent corn crop, because the microbes in the soil are so busy breaking down that biomass during the growing season. It takes a long time to fully decompose that biomass, and the corn can suffer. So here's an interesting thing from that same study about weed biomass. So there's increased biomass suppresses weeds up to a certain point. And then after that, more species don't really help anymore. Okay. So here's another issue that we see in cover crop mixtures. Pretty much every paper that is coming out now has to address this issue, which is the dominance of cereal rye. So if you look at this graph, they're showing the number of seeds, or the number of plants per square meter at seeding. That's on the left-hand side of the x-axis. And then looking at how the population of cover crop plants changes from germination to fall biomass to spring biomass. So you can just see that while the cereal rye starts out as about 20% of the population in the beginning, it ends up as 80% of the population by spring. So cereal rye just takes over. And what all of these studies are finding is that if they use any more than 20% of the monoculture rate of rye in a mixture, any more than 20%, and rye just takes over the mixture. So that's a really important part of designing mixture for healthy soil and healthy crop production, is limiting the amount of those really dominant species, especially dominant grass species. And this is what Penn State found. They actually had to scrap their first year of research because cereal rye just took over everything. But I'm showing you this slide to sort of show you that their seeding rates, this is in pounds per acre. You kind of want to look at the mixtures towards the bottom of this chart. So they're using rates of like 10 pounds an acre of crimson clover, 22 pounds an acre of triticale, and 20 pounds an acre of winter pea. So that's, so they've really adjusted those rates based on how they fit in a mixture. And if you look at the mixture where radish is listed first, radish is another sort of dominant species. So they're just using 1 pound an acre of radish in that mixture, whereas a monoculture rate would be more like 5 pounds an acre. So that research is available publicly from Penn State if you want to look more into their cover crop cocktails. They have a whole web page, and that's really awesome and easy to read. And here's a little more research that I thought was really interesting when you're thinking about selecting species for a cover crop mixture and you're thinking about the roots. We often think about, like, say, rye and vetch, for example, the above ground architecture and complementarity. But you also actually want to think about how the roots are growing underground. What's the architecture like down there? So in this graph, you can see that on the left-hand side, you have the root biomass in between the rows, in between where the cover crops were planted, and the right-hand graph is the root biomass in row. So it's not surprising that the crimson clover root biomass is much lower, just from what we know of that plant. But it's really interesting to see that triticale is actually spreading out aggressively in between rows and producing a lot more biomass sort of across the whole soil profile. And so we want to grow, it might be nice to actually mix canola and triticale so that you can sort of combine that like deep rooting of the canola and the broad branching rooting of the triticale. Another really interesting thing that a lot of research is looking at right now is how to balance the nitrogen retention and supply of cover crop mixtures. And so the most sort of well-respected research right now is actually suggesting that you try and really aim for low soil nitrate in the fall. You don't actually, if you're planting a fall or winter cover crop, you don't really want much residual nitrogen because that ends up producing too much biomass, which is difficult to decompose in the spring. So you want to sort of aim to not have much excess nitrate in the fall, which can be hard to do in vegetable systems. And then you want to have sort of low proportion of grass species in your mixture, so 20% of the monoculture rate, and potentially, and then you have to adjust that if you have numerous grass species in your mixture. And then also another tip is that soils with high organic matter can actually tolerate a higher percentage of grasses and still supply nitrogen to the following crop. And that's because they're just able to provide a little more of the nitrogen from the organic matter and contribute that forward during biomass decomposition. So this is just sort of trying to sum up the relationship between increased cover crop biomass. You have these positives and negatives. You get a lot more weed suppression, you prevent nitrate leaching, you get more biomass. And on the other hand, it can actually negatively impact nitrogen availability to your subsequent crop and reduce yield. And similarly, with your increasing your cover crop carbon to nitrogen ratio, you see this. The higher the carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's good for preventing nitrogen leaching, nitrogen loss, but it can also negatively impact your yield. This basically is a complicated way of looking at how it's important to combine grasses and legumes if you're looking at weed suppression. So the combination of grasses and weeds is particularly good for weed suppression. It doesn't usually produce quite as much biomass, but the weed biomass is much more effectively reduced. And this is just sort of a little snapshot from my research, which is this idea that cover crops release different amounts of nitrogen at different points in the season. So on the left, you have the mixture of peas, oats, and forage radish, which sort of maximizes its nitrogen availability in May. And then if you look at the right-hand side graph, it's oats and forage radish, and that has its maximum nitrogen availability in mid-June, which in this case, I was growing sweet corn, and that was more appropriate timing. So this is something that you can easily measure just using soil nitrate tests, but it's also sort of important to think about as you design a mixture, how much nitrogen is in there and when is it going to be cycled to my crop. Then the last thing I want to mention talking about designing mixtures is planting date. So in the Northeast, this is such a critical issue with our short growing season and cold winter temperatures. So if you're talking, and actually I should say this slide is focused on fall and winter cover crops, but we're finding that you really have to plant them quite early to get full benefits from these cover crops. So the picture actually shows you the difference between a cover crop that's planted in late September and one that's planted in the last, let's see, on the left it's the 28th of August, and on the right it's the 28th of September. So you really need sufficient time for growth to get good ground cover and to compete with the weeds. If you don't get those things planted early enough, often your peas don't have any time to fix nitrogen before they're winter killed, for example. So this is some research from the University of Vermont about how we plant our cover crops. So we have broadcast on the left, broadcast in mid-August, and then drilled after harvest. And so you can see that drilling cover crops is hugely more effective in terms of getting a good establishment in the fall. And that can be hard for a lot of small-scale farmers, although people more and more are developing sort of sneaky ways to adapt their seeders to plant cover crops in the fall the same way they would plant their spinach in the spring. And we're finding that to be really effective. But you can just see that it's not worth spending the money on your cover crop if you're not going to have a good way to get it established. And even when you're broadcasting, that can mean, rolling something over your seeds to just get good seed to soil contact, even if you're broadcasting. But establishment is essential. Oh man, running out of time here. I think I'll skip over this. There are a lot of cover crop mixtures that are being trialed in Vermont. If you just Google UVM cover crop mixes, you can find a lot of their data. But they're looking at trying to combine radish for fall nitrate scavenging and then grasses for biomass production. And it's interesting, they're seeing really different results comparing, this is percent ground cover, so you can see that some do a lot better than others at getting established. And then they produce quite a range of biomass, looking at, depending on whether some of the species are winter killed or not. I'm going to leave, that's a lot of data, but I'm going to sort of focus on this before we run out of time, which is practical ways to design your own cover crop mixture. So you want to start by identifying the top 3 desired services from your cover crop. So for most of us, that would be ground cover to physically protect the soil, perhaps nitrogen scavenging, and biomass production. And then you want to figure out when you're going to plant it. Is this a spring cover? Are you going to grow it in the main season, a fall cover crop? And then how are you going to terminate that and when? Because that can definitely affect what species you're going to select. So you want to pick a group of cover crops that are going to do all of these things in your time window. And then you want to narrow it down. I actually like to use mixtures that are 3 species, just because I think it's a little easier to sort of take care of them, to get them well established, and to still get all the maximum benefits, 3 or 4 species. You want to make sure that you have complementarity of growth forms, of above ground architecture, different types of roots. something with a taproot, something with fibrous branching roots. And then you ideally want a mixture of nitrogen acquisition strategies. So some legume that's going to fix nitrogen and some grass that's going to scavenge it. And then you actually want to look at your mixture. Say you've come up with peas, oats, and forage radish. You want to look at, and let's add crimson clover in there. And so then you want to sort of look at the cover crops and say, is anything missing here? Are there any major drawbacks that are going to occur? And you want to drop that species from the mix. So we have trouble with crimson clover getting it established. It's expensive, and so I'm going to drop that out of my theoretical list. And then you could consider adding another species back in if you want, or just leaving it with 3 species if you like. And then you have to figure out the appropriate seeding mix and planting method. So we're going to look at, let's see, that's the next slide. So you're going to look at the canopy type. I already talked about that. Oh, and the other thing to think about is nitrogen levels in the soil where you're establishing your cover crop mix. If you have really low nitrogen levels, you could plant more legumes. An alternative would actually be to fertilize your cover crop if you don't have enough time in the fall to get legumes established. Some people actually just fertilize their grass cover crops, and that's another strategy. Has its pros and cons. But it's a lot easier to grow vigorous legumes in the spring or summer than in the fall, I've found. And then to the right here, there's a few ideas of some people like to mix winter killed and winter hardy species because the winter hardy species can really take off in the spring and use the nitrogen that is left behind from the winter killed species. So I know a few people who are using a mixture of radish and triticale, and the triticale will take off in the spring and really use any nitrate that's released by the dead radishes. Drill seeding is a good idea. And then some people actually like, instead of mixing their cover crop mix species, to do an alternate row configuration, to use a seeder or a drill where they can actually just do every other row. There's a row of peas, a row of oats, a row of peas, a row of oats. And sometimes people can get more precise seeding that way. So this is a really helpful guide to how to design your seeding rates for a mixture. So winter hardy grasses like rye, for example, should be reduced 1/2 to 1/4 of the monoculture rate. So, and actually I presented that research previously that said 20% of the monoculture rate for rye. So that's essential. You want to reduce, and then number 2, you want to reduce the rate of any species that are functionally redundant. So if you have annual ryegrass and triticale, you actually want to divide the seeding rate for those by 2. And that reduction is done after you've halved the rate for these winter hardy grasses. So, you can imagine that the more species that you plant that are functionally redundant, you just want to sort of keep reducing that seeding rate because they're just going to compete with each other. And then this is a little counterintuitive. Number 3, legumes should be planted at or near monoculture rates. So it's kind of wild. For mixtures, the more grasses you put in there, the more you reduce the seeding rate. But legumes basically stay the same. And that's just because they're lousy competitors, and they really need their space in order to establish well. And then there's also sort of this rule of thumb, which usually is already taken care of by rules 1 and 2. But if you have a highly competitive species, you also want to make sure that it's below this threshold rate of 25 pounds an acre. Usually, if you've reduced it to 20% of the monoculture rate, that's around 25 pounds an acre. But this is just to hammer it home that you really want to limit those highly competitive grasses. And then overall, once you've adjusted all of those rates for your grasses and legumes, you want to make sure that you still have at least 30 pounds an acre. There are hardly any mixtures that do well below 30 pounds an acre. And then there's this rule number 6 is very specific just to radishes. which is that they're also competitive in their own way. So you want to at least half the monoculture rate of forage radish. And a lot of people, when they're using 3 or 4 species, they reduce it even further. In the mixtures for my graduate research, my radish rates were like between 1 and 2 pounds within a mixture, whereas the monoculture rate is about 5 pounds. And then lastly, there's a huge difference in seeding rate if you're broadcast seeding or if you're drilling. So a lot of cover cropping resources, books will have it listed separately for broadcast seeding or drilled seeding, but you want to use rates that are specific to your type of seeding. And I think the rule of thumb is if you only have rates listed for drill seeding, you want to increase that by 50% for broadcast. So let's see, what time is it here? Oh my gosh, time to be done. So I'm skipping over a bunch of my graduate research. And I'm going to sort of leave you with this. In terms of using cover crop mixtures to manage your soil, one major thing that has nothing to do with cover crops is managing your soil pH. So even cover crops don't grow well in an acidic soil, and I cannot tell you how many farms I visited where they think their soil pH is fine, and then you take a test and it's 5.5, which is actually technically considered toxic for vegetable crops. So you really want to start out figuring out if your soil pH is within a reasonable range and treating that if it's an issue, because cover crops don't grow well in really acidic soils, and neither do vegetables for that matter. And then you want to, once you've managed for your soil pH, you want to really think about the goals for your cropping system. What cover crops will serve you well in terms of managing your soil health and producing happy vegetables. And then also making sure that if you're wanting to cycle nutrients, that they're there to begin with. There are occasionally soils that are low in sulfur or boron or nitrogen, where you have to supply a little bit to start with in order for your cover crops to cycle those. And then one of the healthiest things you can do for your soil is to reduce the amount of tillage or the intensity of tillage. Even if you're tilling regularly, but you just stop rototilling, that can make a big difference. And then rule number 5 is just don't plant too much rye. So I just wanted to thank a bunch of people for sharing their results with me. Kirsten Workman at UVM Extension and Emily Rice at Cornell shared a bunch of their research. And my advisor is Masood Hashemi, who loves cover crops and often presents at NOFA conferences. And then I'll just leave you with my list of favorite resources. So my favorite cover crop book is published by SARE. It's called Managing Cover Crops Profitably. There's also the Northeast Cover Crop Handbook, which is awesome, and you can buy it at Johnny's or from the Rodale Institute. And then there's this great online cover crop calculator where you can design your own mixes called, it's from Green Cover Seed. It's such a great resource. It has all the monoculture rates listed, and you can sort of tweak a mix and see how the rates that you're designing change the mixture and the cost of it. And then there's also this really great online resource, which if you can just Google the title, and it's estimating plant available nitrogen from cover crops. And I think one of the hardest things, especially for organic farmers, is if you're growing all of these cover crops, it's often really hard to know how much and when is available for your crop. And this is a really great guide if you want to get technical about it and actually take some samples from your cover crop, figure out how much nitrogen is in there. It gives you these step-by-step instructions, and is really, I think, a great resource. And also, it also just provides some tables where you can, it provides rules of thumb. You don't have to go to all the trouble if you don't want to, but it gives you more general rules of thumb also. Yeah, so I'll just leave you with that. And let's see if I can see if there are any questions here.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. That was
Sure.
that was in depth and that was great. And you've gone a long way in your research. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to give us this information. And just to let everyone know, Julie will be presenting at the Winter Conference next month, January 13th at Worcester State University. So if you want to see this a little bit more in depth, please come out and see her workshop. I'm looking forward to it. I intend to be there. We have a few questions that came over, and if you want, you still have time to either send it to me via chat or text it to me at 413-214-1237. And one of the first questions that came through was concerning microbial life, and if there is no microbial life that's existing, can cover crops actually assist in creating that microbial life in the soil?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's pretty amazing how long soil bacteria can remain dormant. They need food, those microbes. And so as soon as you plant food, you know, there is one dormant bacteria and it will wake up when it comes in contact with those sugars and start reproducing. So a lot of people think it's really important to sort of seed the soil, so you're starting with higher populations to begin with, because if your soil is really quote-unquote dead, cover crops will certainly increase the biological populations, but it might be a little more slowly than if you, say, put down a small application of compost and then planted cover crops into that. So it's kind of like the idea of probiotics, right? You're just you still have to provide the substrate to feed the bacterial population, but if you start out with more to begin with, you get a faster increase.
Okay, very good. Another question came through concerning biomass with your cover crops. Is there such a thing as having an overproduction of biomass?
Yeah. I mean, overproduction is a concern in terms of just having too much residue to deal with in your field or garden. Like if you have a lot of rye that's been produced and you have to mow that and incorporate it, you can often end up with just like a huge amount of sort of stemmy residue that gets in your way of transplanting, or if it's incorporated unevenly, can be sort of in clumps in your soil and not decompose well, not break down quickly enough. So the concern about too much biomass is really a concern about both sort of physically being a hindrance and also in terms of immobilizing nitrogen, because a lot of biomass will take a lot of nitrogen to break it down, and it'll take time. So it could be that you're not actually releasing the cover crop nitrogen until August, if you have a huge amount of biomass that is slow in decomposing.
Concerning cover cropping mixtures, and there are two questions that came through. One on working with legumes. How do they function with your cereal grains such as rye and oats? How do they work together to create that biomass?
How do legumes and grasses work together?
Mm-hmm.
They occupy really different niches. So if you planted two grasses, they would be competing for the existing nitrogen in the soil. But if you plant a legume and a grass, then the legume scrounges around for soil nitrate. But the legume, it doesn't want to compete with the grass for that, so it starts producing its own. So, you know, in this symbiotic relationship with rhizobacteria, the legume is actually fixing atmospheric nitrogen on its own. So it's increasing the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil, while the grass is just sort of immobilizing what's already there. And so the fact that they're complementary and different ways of managing nitrogen are what increases the nitrogen in your cover crop mixture.
Okay. And then our last question for tonight, I find this to be kind of a universal one that came through. Are there cover crop mixtures that can be undersown with growing production crops, say if you undersow a mixture with maybe a tomato crop?
Yeah, there's so much work being done right now trying to find good mixtures for this, and it's really hard. And it depends a lot on the crop that you're trying to interseed with. So it's one of those questions that's hard to answer because it sort of depends. But I do know that people have had decent luck putting in mixtures of radish and rye, especially like in radish. Oh, it's radish, rye, and clover in between the rows of tomatoes, and they basically have their harvesters try and walk closer to the plants and not trample the cover crop entirely. But people find that once those tomatoes are done, the cover crop will really take off in between. A lot of the problem with intercropping is that its access to the cash crop often can really trample the cover crop. But so far, the people are having the best luck with sort of sturdy grasses like annual ryegrass and cereal rye and clovers. So a rye clover or ryegrass clover mixture seem to have the best luck so far. And actually, I'm just starting to email with someone at Johnny's who's been doing a lot more experiments on the Johnny's farm. And so I'll have more information about that at the conference in January.
Okay. Great. Wow. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Just to let everyone know that this presentation will be up in our archives by the end of the week. So we're looking at Friday, no later than Monday. So you can see this over and over again, and please get this out to a friend. Also, as I mentioned before, Julie will be presenting at the Winter Conference, January 13th at Worcester State University. If you're interested in coming, please look to our website at nofamass.org, and registration is still going on online, so I hope to see you there. Again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time. Look for our lineup for 2018. That should be up on our website early January. And if you have any suggestions or want to see a particular topic, feel free to email me at anna@nofamass.org. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night and have a safe and wonderful holiday season. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.